This is a sort of bonus episode related to my clay pot series that doesn't quite fit anywhere in the main sequence. Let's call this episode 2.3 and 3/8 A, subsection 2. The question is, what happens if you mix clay with something a bit unexpected? Before we go any further, I must remedy an omission. One thing that accidentally got culled from the episode 3 edit was the dye. It fired okay inside the largest of the 3 small pinch pots. It came out very dark, possibly indicating that it's only low fired, but it looks fine. I don't intend to use it in earnest, as it will certainly not be a fair dye, and probably not all that hard wearing. Since one of Steph's pots is a little dice tumbler, I decided to give it to her. A bit of background. When I was adding the crushed seashells to the purified clay in part 2, I was struck by how it resembled the process of flouring a work surface and kneading pastry or bread dough. The shelly clay thing was already a rabbit hole from a rabbit hole, but it turns out we can always go one rabbit hole deeper. Clay is and was commonly mixed with other materials, usually mineral in origin, such as sand or ground up potsherds, or primarily mineral-like in composition, such as crushed seashells. But it turns out that people also used to grog their clay with organic fillers too. The benefit of this supposedly being an improvement in consistency, and also as the pots are fired, the organic material burns out and forms escape channels for gases that might otherwise cause the pot to spoil or explode. Well, I had plenty of clay left, so I had to try this. I thought about using sawdust or bran, but eventually settled on wholemeal flour, which I think will be fine enough to mix in, but coarse enough to make a difference of some kind. I measured about a cup of wholemeal flour and, rough estimate, about 3/4 of a kilo of clay. Then set about working the flour into the clay. A horrible mess at first, as this pure clay is still pretty moist, but as the flour took up some of the moisture in the clay, it became more and more coherent and pleasant to handle. I eventually managed to get about half of my cup of flour into the clay, which I kept kneading and wedging until it felt like it was fairly uniform. The remaining flour will have to go in the compost bin now. The result is interesting. The clay seems to have lost a lot of plasticity and it tears quite easily. But maybe I need to leave it for the flour to properly hydrate. In bread making, we'd be talking about resting to hydrate the starch and develop the gluten, but I don't think that, at least the gluten part, will play much of a role here, just because of the fairly small proportion of flour compared to clay, and there's so much other stuff in the mix to interfere with gluten cross-linking. Anyway, I left that in a plastic bag for a couple of hours, after which time it did seem more consistent in texture, but there's still not a lot of strength to this mixture. It tears and cracks really easily. In case you're wondering if strong flour might have made it more coherent, it wouldn't, because that's what I did actually use. Anyway, for this clay, I'm going to attempt to make a sort of dish with a lid. So I cut a couple of pieces out of a compostable plastic bag. I chose this because it's very thin, soft and flexible, so hopefully it won't mark the clay too much with creases. I rolled out the flour grog clay on a board on top of this plastic using an empty beer bottle as a rolling pin. Then I released the clay from the plastic to allow it to deform and pressed it into a bowl. And yes, this is a piece of ordinary tableware that we actually use. It'll be fine, in fact better than fine, when I've washed it up later, trust me. It was pretty easy to get the clay into place and smooth it out. Then I trimmed off the overhang, again very much like pastry work, and smoothed out the edge. I rolled a very long and thin and hopefully consistent coil of clay, then roughed up a line slightly inside the rim of my dish, applied a bit of moisture and slip, and then added this coil. I pressed it into place all the way round, then blended it in, inside and out, then smoothed the blended line and worked this roll of clay into more of a ridge. More smoothing with slightly wetted fingers, and that's actually looking pretty good. For the other half of my 2-part dish, the same process, but with this one, I added a coil of clay right at the edge of the rim. The idea is this will be the base, the other one will be the lid, and the 2 rims will fit one inside of and on top of the other. More smoothing and blending and forming, and it's possible to flatten out irregularities at this point by turning it upside down on the board and pressing it down gently. Some more smoothing, in fact lots of smoothing, all with the fingertips at this point, but I might burnish the inside later. Then it's time to leave these to set up a bit. Obviously the underside of both of these will not dry out as it's in contact with the bowl and the bag liner, but hopefully the pieces will lose enough moisture overnight to be firm enough to take out of the form in order to smooth out the other side. I covered them with paper towels to allow controlled drying. Finally, I made the smallest possible pinch pot, which wasn't easy as this clay just cracks and pulls apart when it's stretched and formed. Eventually, after several tries, I made this little thing, which will be the handle that I apply to the top of the lid. I'll store this in a plastic bag so it doesn't dry out so fast, and that should make it easier to apply to the top the next day. So, this flour grog clay has a reasonable amount of stiffness, which makes it good to work without leaving finger marks and dents, but it has very little wet strength or pliability, and bending it just makes it crack. The next morning we can see that the clay has shrunk back a little from the edge of the form bowl, and the pieces are firm enough to handle. Peeling off that compostable plastic bag liner, we can see that there are a few marks and creases to smooth out and blend, but these aren't, as far as I can tell, deep cracks, just surface texture. By the way, the narration that you're listening to here, as for all of the videos in this series, was all recorded at once at the end of the video recording for each episode, but reading from a script that was written piece by piece at each day or stage. In other words, the me that is speaking these words knows more about how this all turned out than the me that wrote these words, the other me is speaking. Script writing me doesn't know any more than you've seen from watching up to this point. Exciting, isn't it? Anyway, I smoothed over the crease marks using a little bit of additional moistened clay where necessary, and it's still important not to press too hard here, as the piece could be easily crushed and deformed, as the walls are really pretty thin. In fact, at this point I'm wondering if I made this all too thin. Oh well, too late to go back now. The outside lip of each piece was a little bit rough and protruding, so I shaved this back with a seashell, then rubbed it over with my finger. I need to be very careful here, as it would be easy to distort the shape. After smoothing the rim, I realised I'd marred the outside surface quite a bit, so I had to go over that one more time for smoothing. Both pieces are pretty much the same to clean and smooth off, and it all went pretty well, and just to check, I gently fitted the pieces together. So a sort of flying saucer-shaped casserole dish is what we'll end up with if it all works out. There's one more detail to add at this stage, the handle for the lid. So I roughed up the mating surfaces with a seashell, applied a little bit of slip that I'd just made up in my palm, then pressed the two pieces together firmly, supporting the thin wall of the lid from the inside. For extra strength, I rolled a tiny coil of clay and applied this to the join, then pressed and blended it into place, finally smoothing over to blend the shape of the handle cleanly into the lid. Now I can wash up those two dessert bowls that I used as forms, and as I mentioned earlier, they clean up just fine. In fact, better than fine. One thing I've noticed here is that a cleaned item that had clay on it actually comes out brighter and cleaner than usual. There are probably a few reasons for this. Firstly, and most obviously, if there's actual mud on something, you're likely to clean it a bit more thoroughly than if it was custard. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think, in fact, the microscopic grains of clay are probably gently scouring off limescale deposits from previous washes, and given that this clay is also probably slightly alkaline in chemistry, it may be transforming any residual greases or oils into soap, which is easier to wash away and, of course, would have its own cleaning properties. The effect is a little bit hard to see on camera, but here are two glasses. The one on the left is clean, straight out of the cupboard, and you can hopefully see it's not quite as sparklingly clean as the one on the right, which is the glass that I used to carry the flour outside to blend with the clay, and this glass got a little bit caked with clay at that point. So there we are, the cleaning power of dirt. Anyway, day 3 of drying under paper, and the pieces are now firm enough to be handled. I smoothed out the rims a bit more and test fitted the pieces. They're still a bit irregular, but the tolerance is very forgiving. When they're drier, I might be able to rotate them against each other to grind them down a bit to fit better. I think the lid needs a vent for steam to come out of if this is ever used as a cooking dish. If we get that far, that is. The middle of the handle isn't the best place for all possible reasons, as it means the handle could get too hot to touch, but I'm assuming it would anyway. So the vent goes here. If I put it anywhere else, it will be asymmetric and it might introduce a fault that destroys the piece in firing. After a week of drying, the pieces have shrunk noticeably, but they also feel good and firm. I think the flour in the mixture might be hanging onto the moisture a bit more than the clay normally does, so we will give these extra time to dry off completely. After another couple of weeks of drying, I reckon these pieces are good for firing now. And I'm going to try to do that inside the little fire pit brazier that I made from a helium gas bottle in another video. Script writing me has to confess not a high degree of confidence about this venture, but let's press on. I started off with some pieces of kindling and an oily paper towel, then a layer of lumpwood charcoal. The pot goes on top of that, then more charcoal around it and on top of it, finishing off with quite a heap of charcoal in there. I lit it with a little help from my blowtorch. This might seem a bit weird and stupid, but stay with me. I made another pile of kindling on top of the fire and lit that. Not only will it ignite the charcoal at the top of the heap, but the other thing this small fire will do up here is create an updraft, which will draw air in through the vent holes at the bottom of the brazier. After a little while, the charcoal all got going, nice and hot, glowing throughout its entire mass. I added some fallen dead twigs from the oak tree in my garden, because why not, and allowed that to burn down too. Then I placed the lid on the brazier. This is just made from the top section of the gas bottle with some little protruding tabs bent outwards so it doesn't just fall off. 3 reasons for putting the lid on. Firstly, it will stifle the fire a little bit. And this should hopefully create a reduction firing environment where the fire steals oxygen from the clay, reducing the minerals in it to a more metallic form, which supposedly is a good thing. Nextly, it was about to start raining, and the lid will stop the rain from quenching the fire. And finally, the enclosed environment might allow more even cooling, which might help to avoid failure. We will see. The next morning, I removed the lid and started moving aside the ashes. Everything was just lukewarm at this point, and at first I thought I had an intact fired piece, but as I pulled it out, I saw a big hole where it had spalled, as well as some cracks. The bottom piece had fared a little bit better, but not much. Again, spalling and cracks. This is definitely fired ceramic. You can tell from the noise it makes when it's tapped, but it's very crumbly and porous and can be broken apart with very little effort. So what went wrong this time? Well, I think it's probably true that this little fireplace is too small to fire a pot of this size. I reckon smaller pinch pots would probably fire okay in here, but this took up so much space inside that it restricted the room left for fuel, which means a short burn, which means a very low firing. But interestingly, these pieces failed in a manner that we didn't see with any of the other pots. That is, spalling. Big flakes of the surface breaking away. And I think there's a reason for that. I believe what happened here is, even though I did consolidate the surface of these pots, the starches in the flour grog might have formed a sort of hard outer crust when they dried first, and then when the material inside dried and shrank as it inevitably would, it pulled away from itself and formed almost a double wall, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but it would be incredibly susceptible to uneven heating or cooling if one layer expands or contracts more than the other. I don't think plain thermal shock was to blame. In fact, the remaining low-fired sherds can be heated quite suddenly and unevenly with my blowtorch, and, against my expectations, they don't crack or flake at all. There is more to say about the suitability in general of this clay for making pots. All of the pieces, even the ones that worked okay in the main firing, are a bit sort of bricky, rather than potty. And as I mentioned in episode 1, local clay has been used a lot from round here to make bricks, and at the same time there's not a lot of local tradition about pottery, so maybe the clay is the reason. Anyway, this pot was, sort of unsurprisingly, another failure. I did think about grinding it up to use as grog, but it had such a low firing that I think that would just be asking for trouble. There's still clearly quite a bit of carbon incorporated into the clay. Meanwhile, I've taken some time to digest the meaning of the firing failures from part 3 and consider my actions to remedy them. I've already begun making my next round of pots, of which hopefully I can get at least one fired intact, to take us onward to the cooking episode. Here's a sneak preview of one of them and a spoiler on a couple of the changes I'll be making. That is, thinner walls and no abrupt angles on the base or rim, just a continuously curved profile. So that's where we are for now, and there is more to come shortly. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.